Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming this evening. Can everybody hear me, or is that, I don't know what that's all about, I guess. So I'm Don Brand. I'm a professor in the political science department, but more importantly for this evening, I'm also a co-director of the Charles Carroll program. For those of you who haven't been to a Charles Carroll event earlier, let me introduce you to the program. Charles Carroll was the only Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. That's how we get our name. And we have been generously funded by an alum, Bob Hensler, who unfortunately has passed away. But Bob Hensler's dedication to Holy Cross, he was a Holy Cross grad quite a number of years ago, but he was very concerned that there was not on the campus an adequate presentation of diverse views, ideological views on campus. And so he was committing to achieving that. And he's made possible the programs like the one we have this evening, where I'm very proud to introduce Professor Josh Muravchik, author of Heaven on Earth, a wonderful book, and I don't get royalty kickbacks, by the way. But this is one of the most enlightening books I have ever read on the history of socialism. I have the 2002 version, Heaven on Earth, The Rise and Fall of Socialism. Professor Muravchik has been forced to publish a new edition, which takes account of the fact that socialism seems to have made something of a rebirth with people like Bernie Sanders here in the United States, or AOC, and otherwise on the European continent as well. So while Professor Muravchik is the author of Heaven on Earth, this wonderful history of socialism, he's also got 10 other books, hundreds, literally hundreds of articles published in such sources as the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the New York Times Magazine, Commentary, The New Republic. He served as an editor on the editorial board of World Affairs, Journal of Democracy, Journal of International Security. He's been a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, at the Foreign Policy Institute of Johns Hopkins School for Advanced International Affairs. He's been a member of the State Department's Advisory Committee on Democracy Promotion, and the Wall Street Journal has described him as perhaps the most coherent, careful of the neoconservative writers on foreign policy. Professor Muravchik may give a bit of an autobiographical commentary. He, earlier in life, I'm not spilling the beans here, was a member of the Young Socialist? Young People's Socialist League. So that, but he's had, he's had an intellectual journey concerning socialism, which reminds me of a famous quote by David Lloyd George. "A young man who isn't a socialist hasn't got a heart. An old man who is a socialist hasn't got a head." Professor Muravchik's book might help to accelerate the intellectual journey of those of you so inclined at this point in your lives.
Thank you, Professor Brand, and thank you all for being here. I'm honored that you've come and give me a chance to express my ideas to you, and I will stay as long as you want to hear your responses or questions. David Lloyd George, now I have always thought that quote was attributable to Clemenceau, who, after all, made a left-to-right intellectual journey of his own. But however, it's certainly not Churchill, to whom it's most often misattributed, who made no such journey. In any case, as Professor Brand mentioned, suddenly socialism seems very much on America's agenda, which is kind of startling because it's never been on America's agenda before. this has been the least socialist country in the world, or at least among free or developed countries in the world. Every place else where there's some political freedom, socialist parties, communist parties, what have you, have been major players in the political system, with America being the big exception. The most successful socialist party electorally in the United States, there have been the Communist Party, Socialist Labor Party, Socialist Workers' Party, but the most successful was the Socialist Party, which reached its apogee in the presidential election of 1908, or no, 1912, when his presidential candidate, Eugene Debs, got 6% of the vote. After that, the socialist vote quickly sank to 1%, and then to 1/10 of 1% and 1/100th of 1%, until socialists basically gave up running for office altogether. And you could argue, if you look at the broad history of socialism, that in the latter part of the 20th century, when it had gained sway in one form or another in many places around the world, what kept the world from going socialist as a whole was the stalwart resistance of the United States to socialism. And the United States, being such a powerful and influential country, its presentation of a counter model to socialism. And yet suddenly something new has happened here. We have Bernie Sanders, who is arguably the front runner, or one of the front runners for the Democratic nomination for president, who has made a point of calling himself a democratic socialist. And we have public opinion polls which show much greater support for or interest in socialism than ever before in the United States, including the Pew survey of last year, in which people were asked whether they had favorable or unfavorable views toward socialism, and the same thing toward capitalism. And at least among those who identified as Democrats, there was a much higher response of favorable to socialism than to capitalism. It's curious that this bubbles up now in the United States, because few ideas, if any, few political ideas, if any, have been given as thorough and conclusive a test as socialism. Socialism was the most popular political idea ever invented. You could make a case that it was the most popular idea of any kind about how life ought to be lived or society organized. The only thing that could compare with socialism's popularity would be the great religions. And even here, it's not clear that they have been more popular. To just take a number that's illustrative rather than probative, the most widely adhered to religion in the world is Christianity. And it took 300 years from the time of the founding of Christianity until Christianity could claim to speak for 10% of the people of the world. In half that much time, in 150 years, from the time that the word socialism was first coined, we reached a point in which 60% of the population of the world was living under governments calling themselves socialist. Now, of course, not everyone who lived under a socialist government believed in socialism. many may have hated it. On the other hand, when we count Christians, we're generally counting people who lived in polities where the monarch was a Christian. We don't really know if those people believed in it either. In any case, I don't mean to push the comparison too far, just to show you how powerful this idea has been. And in fact, whatever the relationship of the citizens to their governments that practiced or that preached socialism, we know that millions and millions of people did, in fact, embrace socialism, believe in it, join socialist parties, vote for it. Many fought and died for it. And it was, as Professor Brand alluded to, a big part of my own history, my background. My grandfather abandoned the faith of his father to take up with socialism as a guiding idea of his life, and my father followed in his footsteps, and I followed in theirs when I was a younger man, and I joined the Young People's Socialist League in 1962, which happens to have been the same exact year that Bernie Sanders joined the same organization. To look back, socialism grew out of the French Revolution with its slogan of liberté, égalité, fraternité, freedom, equality, and brotherhood, the idea that the world could be made wholly anew by revolution, by political action. The revolution itself was not socialist per se. In fact, the revolutionary proclamations asserted the right of private property, but that idea of liberty, equality, and brotherhood carried with it an implication from which many drew the inference of socialism. And in fact, during the revolution itself, there was one group that arose called the Conspiracy of Equals, led by a visionary man by the name of Babeuf, who hit on the idea that if we're going to have real equality, social equality, political equality, it has to start with economic equality. If not, none of the other forms of equality will be meaningful. And so if we want to try to apprehend an overall history of socialism, we start with the French Revolution and think of the first 120 years of this history. There was no government on earth that was socialist. It was a time from the French Revolution till the Russian Revolution, this idea was spreading and being developed and percolating. But it's not to say there was no government on earth in that time that was socialist, but it's not to say that socialism wasn't put into practice anywhere in that early stage. Starting in the 1820s, a group of visionaries, of thinkers in England and France, Thomas Owen, Charles Fourier, Constant Simon, Etienne Cabet, those are the names of some of these writers who spent their time kind of dreaming up what would be a different society, what would be an ideal society, and one in which, in all their cases, in which there would be a kind of sharing of property and equality and some form of socialist system. And over the next decades, they themselves, in some cases, and various of their followers, set about founding experimental communities where they could practice this way of living that they imagined. They were not interested in making a revolution. They didn't much engage in politics. They weren't trying to overthrow the government or install some new system in the countries in which they lived. Rather, they were doing something on a smaller scale. They thought that they could create communities where they themselves could have the joy of living this better way of life, and also then a secondary political purpose was that they could spread their ideas by example. They'd show the rest of the world what a wonderful way to live this was. Then others would follow in their footsteps. Although the thinkers were mostly Europeans, the communes were almost all formed in the United States. Why? Because it was much easier to do here. It was still a frontier country. You could get land easily and cheaply on the frontier to start a new community. And also, because it was a frontier country, there weren't such strongly fixed social mores. And so if you said, we're going to go over there and start a commune and we're going to share property, people were less likely to become indignant at your nonconformity here in the United States. Over the course of the 19th century, a few hundred communes were started, but the majority of them were religious communes. They often practiced a kind of socialism, that is, they shared their property, but they weren't particularly interested in socialism, in the ideology. They were sharing property because they were trying to form a more perfect community of worship, and common property fit into that. But there were 40 or 50 of these communes that were formed not by religious believers, but by socialist believers who were doing it explicitly for the purpose of showing how well socialism could work in practice. And these 40 or 50 communes almost invariably collapsed in very short order. Their median lifespan was 2 years. And they generally collapsed in disharmony and wrangling and arguing about who was working and who wasn't working and who ought to be working. And so it might have been at that point that the whole idea of socialism would have died around the middle of the 19th century. It was dreamed up, it was tried in 40 or 50 different places. It failed in all of them. The results were in. But instead, the idea was picked up and given a whole new life, and a much more potent one, by this extraordinary tag team of activists, philosophers, economists, agitators, known as Marx and Engels. And Marx and Engels were deeply aware of what had happened with the communes that had been formed in the United States. Engels himself participated in the group meetings in England of the followers of Robert Owen, and he contributed articles to their newspaper. But Marx and Engels, when they came along, simply dismissed out of hand the experience of these communes. And what they said is, they don't count because they're utopian. They were utopian socialists, and we are scientific socialists. And there's a complete difference between the two. And what we're doing is what really matters, not what they did. Why are they utopian? By utopian, Marx did not mean unrealistic. What he meant was that they were trying to create socialism by their own will and voluntary actions. And he said, no, 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 socialism cannot be brought about by people wanting to bring about socialism. That's not scientific. What I have done is discovered the laws of history. And the laws of history show that socialism is destiny. It's going to come about, and as in this case Engels put it, societies evolve just like species evolve. And Darwin has discovered the laws of the evolution of species. And Marx has discovered the laws of the evolution of societies. And these laws show us that it is sort of baked into the human nature and human fate that society will progress to socialism. And that's what they said was scientific socialism. Now, to me, there's something very ironic in all this. That is, what is science? What is to my mind, the very soul of science is experimentation. Who were the utopians? There were a bunch of thinkers who had this idea that socialism would be great. And so what did they do? They created a series of experiments to test their ideas. They were authentic scientific socialists. Marx comes along and says, never mind any human experience, because I have discovered the laws of history. And the laws of history prove that the whole world is fated to end up with socialism. He called it science, but there's a better word for it. It's prophecy. It is sheer religious prophecy, that's where the society is going to end up. But as unscientific as it was, it proved to be amazingly beguiling. And it was the famous British historian and avowed communist, Eric Hobsbawm, who wrote, I'm giving you a little quote here, "It was not until Marx transferred the center of gravity of the argument for socialism from its desirability to its inevitability that socialism acquired its most formidable intellectual weapon." Well, this was a weapon, but it wasn't an intellectual weapon at all. It was a psychological one. And somehow this idea that socialism was the inevitable destiny of the world was tremendously exciting and winning to people. Logically, it shouldn't have been, but psychologically it was. It's, in fact, the allure of knowing that something is destiny or believing that it is. We hear it in common political parlance today when we hear people say, so-and-so is on the wrong side of history, or get on the right side of history, as if history has an appointed direction that the speaker can see. History is going there, and if you want to be with it, you should be on the right side of history. This was the essential appeal of the Marxian prophetic vision. And over the second half of the 19th century, Marx and Engels vanquished all of their competitors, other people who were propounding other versions of socialism. And Marxism became the dominant form of socialism, and to the point where the terms socialism and Marxism became more or less synonymous. But by the turn of the century, one important socialist thinker, Edward Bernstein, who was the designated intellectual heir to Marx and Engels. He was recognized by all as the greatest thinker and theoretician of the Marxist movement. But unlike so many others, he was a very serious empiricist. And he said, wait a second, it's not happening. It's not working out the way it's supposed to be working out. The workers aren't making any kind of revolution. They're not even proposing revolution. And moreover, they're not getting poorer. Part of the whole Marxist prophecy was that the dynamics of capitalism was such that the workers would get poorer and poorer and more desperate, and until eventually they would see that they had no way to fix their lives except by overthrowing capitalism and creating socialism. But this Bernstein said, we have all that, we can look around and we have all the statistics, and we can see that workers are actually living more comfortably than they used to do. And so he took the implication and, in effect, abandoned the idea of socialism, although he didn't say he was doing that. What he said instead was, for me, the final goal is nothing, the struggle is everything. Meaning that he wanted to still work for improving the lot of workers, better wages, better working conditions, shorter hours, but never mind the idea that somehow we're going to give birth to a whole new society which will, in a swoop, transform people's lives. But Bernstein's influential writing on this antagonized many of his socialist comrades, and none was angrier than the Russian socialist Vladimir Ulyanov, who called himself Lenin. Interestingly, Ulyanov agreed with the key observation of Bernstein, that the workers were not showing any signs of going to make a socialist revolution. In Lenin's terminology, the workers are showing that they only achieve trade union consciousness, but not revolutionary consciousness. And so, whereas Bernstein said, well, that I'm going to give up the final goal and just keep working for a better life for the workers. Ulyanov, Lenin said, no, we can't give up the socialist revolution, but the workers aren't going to make it, and so we have to have some substitute body to act for them. And that was to be a compact, secretive party of full-time revolutionaries drawn from the middle class who will make revolution their whole life's work. And thus he put together what was first called the Bolshevik Party. And in fact, he succeeded in seizing power in Russia with a relatively small number of followers in 1917 when the country was in chaos. And as he himself said, power was lying in the street and I picked it up. And this changed everything in the world, and it's the turning point in the history of socialism. Until 1917, it was all the history of play with an idea. But from 1917 on, we start to have countries around the world coming under socialist governments of different kinds and different experiences with socialism in action in different countries. And the fact that Russia now had a self-declared socialist government was huge. Russia was a huge country, the biggest country in Europe. Depending on which set of statistics you look at, it was home to 6 or 8 or even 10% of the population of the world. And the result was a tremendous proliferation of socialist movements and energization of them. First of all, within a few years, there were communist parties in virtually every country. Lenin's group had been called the Bolsheviks, but about a month after seizing power, he decreed that from now on we call ourselves communists. And anyone who wants to follow us in other countries has to call themselves communists. So from that moment on, the word communist takes on a different meaning than it had had before. Before, it just meant people who were interested in communes, but after 1917, communists, usually with a capital C, meant people who admired the regime that Lenin had created in Russia. And there were such admirers around the world, and there were communist parties created around the world. But there were other socialists who didn't accept what Lenin had done, who thought Lenin was too violent and too dictatorial. And they said, no, that's not the socialism we've dreamed of. We want to go about something in a more democratic, peaceful way. And there were also such parties all over the world, usually called Social Democratic Party or Labor Party or sometimes Socialist Party. And an interesting thing was that even they, although they often were weakened, they lost members to the rival, now Communist Party, but in the next few years they were very much strengthened, because even for socialists who didn't accept what Lenin was doing, the fact that there was now a socialist government in one big country seemed to be the vindication of Marx's prophecy, that history had a direction, that capitalism was at its back and socialism was in its future. And I can remember, even, it was years after 1917, but in the 1960s, when I first became involved in the Socialist Party, Young Socialists and so on, that we used to say, there's no question that the world is moving in the direction of socialism. The question that's faced is whether it will be the bad dictatorial kind of socialism that they have in the Soviet Union, or whether it will be a free, democratic, benign kind of socialism that we have in our minds. And in fact, over the next couple of decades, both socialist and communist parties grew up with increasing votes, and for the socialists, increasing opportunities to participate in governments. And then there were other offshoots from the success of Lenin in Russia. One bastard offshoot was fascism and Nazism. There's no one studied Lenin more closely than Mussolini in inventing fascism in Italy, except what Mussolini did was to take the theoretical structure of Marxism and say, why are we talking about just classes? We should also be talking about nations. And he said, Italy is the proletarian nation of Europe because it was poorer than other European nations. And the goal of fascism is for Italy to have a kind of revolution against the bourgeois countries of Europe and gain its rightful place. This era of relatively growth and offshoots of socialism then sort of was interrupted by World War II, as all other life, in a sense, was interrupted by that war. And with the outcome of that war, fascism was destroyed, but the other forms of socialism continued thriving greater than ever before. Most importantly, in the aftermath of World War II, communism spread beyond the Soviet Union. It had for decades been just in the Soviet Union and one other place. Offer a lollipop to anyone who can think of it. Mongolia. The two communist countries in the world. Mongolia, of course, being thanks to the influence of the Soviet Union. But in the aftermath of World War II, either because of the conquests of the Soviet army or because of some indigenous revolutions, communist revolutions, we got to having 18 communist countries around the world. And then the socialist or social democratic parties around the world gained a power like they had never had before. For the first time, they became the government in a whole slew of European and other countries. Before, they had only served in some governments as coalition partners, but now in England, France, Germany, and elsewhere, they became Scandinavia, Austria, Australia, Israel. They became the governing party. And then a whole new kind of socialism appeared, and that was when, in the aftermath of World War II, Africa and the Middle East, parts of Asia, all of which had been colonized by the Europeans, gained their independence and became independent countries, and there were scores of these new countries born, and the big majority of them declared themselves to be socialist. There was African socialism, Arab socialism, and other kinds of, generically it was called third world socialism. And so if you add it all up, by the, say, from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s, there were altogether probably some 70 countries with about 60% of the world's population that declared themselves to be socialist. And this really seemed as if Marx's prophecy was absolutely spot on, that the world was heading toward universal embrace of socialism. And then suddenly, in the blink of an eye, it all collapsed in one form after another of socialism just undid itself. Not from the outside, but from the inside. In the the Soviet Union divested itself of its empire. All of the countries of Eastern Europe that had been part of that empire asserted their independence and moved away from communism. All of the different republics that had made up the USSR also separated themselves from Russia and moved away from communism. And China nearly went the same way in 1989 with the students who protested in Tiananmen Square, but the Communist Party succeeded in suppressing them. But even so, the Communist Party, while it clung, and to this day still clings tenaciously to dictatorial power, it's not practicing socialism anymore, and hasn't been for decades. It's introduced private enterprise. The economy of China is predominantly private, and it's in fact, as a result of this rapid growth and on a largely free market basis, become one of the most unequal countries in the world in terms of income distribution, and a country with lots and lots of billionaires. Then there were aside from the communist world, in the world of the social democrats, the moderate socialists primarily of Europe, there was a turn toward a full-on embrace of private enterprise as economics. The history of those parties and movements was that they always insisted on, they were true believing Democrats, they always insisted on proceeding in a parliamentary way, in a peaceful way, step by step, but it was always their belief that they were moving step by step to full-on socialism. And yet by the 1980s, they revisited that. And it happened in several of the countries at once, really in all of them. But the symbolic representative was Tony Blair in Britain, the leader of the British Labour Party and three-term prime minister, who oversaw the repeal from the Labour Party charter of what was called Clause 4, the famous paragraph in the charter that was the socialist paragraph that called for the collective ownership of the means of production and distribution. And he actually ran for a re-election and using, among other slogans, the slogan, "Labor is the party of business." And you could point to similar things in the others. So the Social Democrats remained liberals in the American sense of the term liberal, and in continuing to advocate different kinds of welfare programs to help people in need of various kinds, young, old, ailing, what have you, but completely moved away from any thought of transforming the economy away from a free enterprise or capitalist economy. And then in the third world, you again saw a dramatic transition that was occasioned by a dramatic comparison, and that is that the bulk of the newly independent countries had pursued socialist economics, that is, state planning was the watchword, and they had overwhelmingly stagnated economically for 20 years. And then there was a dramatic counterexample, and that was the so-called four dragons, or four tigers, as they were variously called, of East Asia, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore, for countries which had pursued a very different economic path, welcoming private enterprise, welcoming foreign investment, producing for export, and creating sort of startup capitalist economies, and they were all flourishing. And this was taken on board by the other developing countries, and as well as by development economists, and almost to a one, the countries of the so-called third world revised their economic policies to embrace private enterprise rather than so-called state planning. And the final part to this story of the dramatic turn away from socialism of every part of the world was a small one, but a telling one. In Israel, there was an institution called the Kibbutz, which I assume you've all heard something about. The kibbutzim is the Hebrew plural. There were about 200 of them. They were home to only a minor portion of the citizens of Israel, but they were home to some maybe 200,000 people, and they were very important institutions. Many of them had been created by the Zionist pioneers before the State of Israel came into being, and they were to many, they were the symbol of Israel, and indeed they produced a disproportionately large part of the political and military elite of the country. And the important thing about them was that they were really a pure laboratory experiment in socialism. They practiced really pure socialism. Everything was owned communally. Even in many of them, clothing. On Friday, you'd take your dirty clothes that you had worn that week to the communal laundry and hand in the bag of laundry, and you'd be handed back a pile of clean clothing to wear for the next week. No one owned any of this clothing. The kibbutz owned it. Even children were raised communally. From infancy, they were put in children's homes with their age group, and they would visit daily with the parents, but they lived from birth in these children's homes. And everything else, all meals were taken in the communal dining room. No one had in their tent or their little cabins where they lived, no one had a stove or a refrigerator or any provision for personal dining. And they were also, unlike in the Soviet Union or what have you, they were purely democratic. One of the things that got on the nerves of people who lived there was often how democratic they were, because there were meetings, often more than once a week, to everything that needed to be done in the kibbutz had to be decided in a meeting. And these kibbutzim were absolutely essential to the birth of Israel and to its getting on the country sort of getting on its feet. But after the wars of 1967 and 73, that were both won by Israel when the country seemed established and secured, starting in the late 70s, the people who lived on these kibbutzim said, "We're tired of living this way. instead of feeling that we live in this utopian commune where we're free of private property and everything belongs to everyone, they said, the country doesn't need us anymore. This is so uncomfortable, having to call a meeting if I want to buy a new alarm clock for my cabin. And they, step by step, transformed away from socialism. And the communities were still there. They are still there to this day, but they're communities based on private ownership and private activity, where people have jobs on the outside, and if there's no one who wants to do a job that needs to be done on the kibbutz, someone is hired from the outside to do the job. And so from in every variety, socialism was dismantled from the inside out. And so by the end of this century which had been largely dominated in its political life by the idea of socialism and the different ways that people pursued it, that story was all over. The idea had failed in every conceivable variant. And then suddenly, in the new century, it all seemed to come back. Not the socialism, but the idea of socialism, whether with Hugo Chavez and his followers in Venezuela, or Jeremy Corbyn, or above all, most interestingly, here in the United States with Bernie Sanders. And this sudden revival of this idea that had been tried so often and had so conclusively failed is, I think, testament to the power of this alluring idea. And it may also be testament to human resistance to learning, which is bad news for your professors. In any case, that's all I have to say for now. Thank you for listening so politely. And I'll be very happy to take questions, or if people want to stand up and disagree with me, you're welcome to do that too. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. So you talked a lot about how Bernie Sanders is now kind of the new face of socialism in the U.S., as well as like the young congresswoman AOC is another one that gets a lot of attention. And AOC recently said that if we were in another country, her and Joe Biden would not be a part of the same Democratic Party because they are so different. Do you see the Democratic Party splitting up and a new socialist party forming in the U.S. and it having to rise and fail like it has in the past? Or do you think due to all this history we learned and now the power of the media to draw attention to how it wouldn't work, that they wouldn't even get the momentum they need?
I think it's very hard to picture that. And it's has less to do with the history of socialism than just the structure of the American political system. In Europe and some other places around the world where you have parliamentary systems and you have coalition governments, that conduces more to having multiple parties. Our experience is that we do have from time to time a third party, and they never seem to endure very long. And with a presidential system, there's an impetus toward having a two-party system. So I think it's unlikely that there'll be a split in that direction. I think that I myself feel pretty politically homeless right now. I think there are some people in the middle who feel, as I do, both that we couldn't support Donald Trump and couldn't support Bernie Sanders. And if that's the choice, I'd be wishing for someone to create a third party in the middle, but it's kind of endemic to political psychology that people who are in the middle usually lack the militancy to create new parties or other things. So it seems to me very unlikely that we'll have some kind of split up like that. Yes, ma'am. Yeah, I'm sorry.
My question is, so you used a lot of examples of socialism throughout history. I just want to get your take on the experiment of capitalism as far as slavery, and like how that can be considered one of the greatest failures of capitalism.
Well, we'd be using the term capitalism very loosely. Usually the term capitalism is a reference to industrial society, whereas slavery in the United States was a phenomenon of agricultural society. It certainly was expressive of a profit motive, if that's what you mean, but slavery was kind of a ubiquitous thing in history. I mean, always a terrible thing, but it was a common thing. If you to go back to biblical times, go back to ancient Greece, and then all the history up until then. So to say that that we're going to count slavery on some kind of balance sheet to the discredit of capitalism, okay, but that's not really what. It's not directly on line with what I was talking about. I wasn't trying to give you a list of the things to be held against socialism. I was trying to describe how socialism had failed, and you certainly say that slavery is a unspeakably terrible blot on the United States and the history of this country, but it's not endemic to capitalism.
I don't think I was trying to say that.
Okay. Okay.
What I was trying to get at is the failures of capitalism that are, in my view, equal to the failures of socialism. So slavery being one of them, but even now, like the neoliberal consequences of the IMF have, like, as you talked about, how many countries have switched from socialism to capitalism, enforced by the IMF and by capitalism and neoliberalism. So, like, my question is basically just, why are the failures that you have picked out more inclusive as failures than other failures of capitalism?
Well,
Could you repeat the question, please?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Why have you chosen the examples that you did to conclude that socialism is impossible or in some ways ill-fated, where there's also many failures of capitalism that
the lady said, why have I picked out the examples I have to show that socialism is ineffective or bad when I failed to pick out as many things to show that capitalism is unsuccessful. But it's really simply not so. You could make a list of terrible things that happened under capitalism, but I didn't really make a list of the terrible things that happened under socialism. I didn't spend time talking about the large number of people, the millions of people who were slaughtered by Stalin, who were slaughtered by Mao and by Pol Pot. I wasn't giving a harangue. I was saying that in each of these cases, and I wasn't picking out things. What I was saying was socialism has taken these various forms, and in each case, socialism was, in effect, repealed by those countries themselves. The Soviet bloc countries in their ways, China keeping the rule of the Communist Party but moving away from socialist economics, the British Labour Party, French Socialist Party, German, Scandinavian, etc., Social Democrat parties, all of them continuing to be big welfare state parties but moving away from socialism. I wasn't giving a litany of their crimes and depredations. On the other side, countries that practice capitalism are not moving away from it. What they have historically done everywhere is to learn, if they had to learn it, that you can't do Rand Paul's dream or whatever. That is, you can't have pure private enterprise society without a significant public sector that, first of all, provides security, army, police, and secondly, provides infrastructure, highways and power and so on, and thirdly, provides various kinds of social welfare for, at least for the most vulnerable people in society. And then you can, and then you can debate about how much you want. There's really a pretty wide consensus in the democratic world that you need to have an economy where wealth is generated in the private sector by private business. But then some share of that wealth is, and can be and is, taken in taxes for public purposes. In the United States, we have a tradition of the public sector being smaller. It's was for a long time in recent generations about 1/3 of the total economy. In the last decade or so, it's gone higher than that, maybe in the upper 30%. And in Europe, which has had different traditions, they have a larger public sector, usually in the upper 40%. And you can, people who have some fondness for the memory of the socialist idea are often people who are advocating a larger welfare state, a larger public sector. And what my observation, what happens either in Europe or in the United States, is that it's kind of cyclical, that people notice problems around and demand some government action, and there get to be new programs or new protections, and then after a while, that gets increasingly expensive, and then you have a voter reaction and people demand lower taxes, and we sort of go back and forth from left of center parties to right of center parties. But what remains uniform is that you have a basically capitalist or free enterprise economy with a welfare state designed to give some protections to people against the hard knocks of a private economy.
Just to sort of, so you're saying there is like a happy medium between the welfare state and capitalist society?
Well, I think all capitalist societies do have welfare states as part of them. I mean, capitalist theory doesn't necessarily have it, but in practice, people everywhere have wanted that. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have a nephew that's 2.5 years old, and I was thinking about this. I mean, socialism has been repudiated in the global context, but there's a form of soft socialism. Like I watched Sesame Street, right? Sharing is caring. The altruistic thing is to share property. But it seems like the moral force for capitalism is not made in the same way. And so socialism still lives, even in the West, as a form of this charitable kind of acceptable attitude. We should all get along, we should all share. And that gets vested, as you talked about, these religious sort of overtones, and the charity is the same as the socialist system. I was wondering if you could talk about why that attractiveness kind of works, that religion gets connected with socialism, and how one might see that more in a more nuanced kind of way.
That may be too big a question. It's an interesting question, maybe too big. I certainly am all for caring and for sharing. I think we should all be as kind and generous as we can be. I think that in Smith's theory of moral sentiments is a very critical observation, and that is that I think the caring and sharing, which I believe in, tends to get off base when we get to the conceit that we're all brothers and sisters, and we're actually not all brothers and sisters. And I think it's natural and morally right for people to feel a special obligation to those who are closest to them, and to do a lot of caring and sharing with their siblings and their spouses and their parents and their children, and then to do some of that with their, but to a lesser degree with their neighbors and friends, and then still to a lesser degree to other people out there we don't know. My wife and I send a fairly significant amount of charitable donations that are going to causes helping people that we will never meet, suffering from diseases that we have only heard of when we receive the fund appeal. But I don't for a moment imagine that I have an obligation to those people that's equivalent to the obligation that I have toward those with whom I'm in closest and most immediate interaction. And I think that observation is very helpful in sorting out what's the proper application of the impulse to caring and sharing, which as an impulse I do nothing but applaud. Yes, sir.
What I'm going to do is not strictly pose a question, suggest a supplement to your remarks, which were highly informative. I knew they would be. In response to the last two questions. One is that I always ask my students not to speak of capitalism, which was a term invented by Marx to signify pejoratively what we call free enterprise economy. It's meant to signify that just like the neutron bomb, which was supposed to be the capitalist weapon because it killed people but didn't destroy buildings, so free enterprise is really about the interest of capital, whatever that is, not human beings. So I always prefer to speak of free enterprise as opposed to socialism, which leads me to a response to both of the last questioners, which is to say that there is a clear moral case for free enterprise, namely freedom. That's what the Declaration of Independence is about. And the United States is the first, and to my knowledge still the only country in history ever to have been founded on a document that proclaims the equal rights of all human beings to freedom. It is, as Frederick Douglass, as well as Abraham Lincoln pointed out, along with the Constitution, an anti-slavery document. Slavery didn't come from capitalism. It was brought here by the Spanish, and later the Brits, and Spain was anything but a free enterprise economy in the 16th century, let alone a free country. And so I would be inclined to both be stronger and say, yes, what is called capitalism is really a free economy. And as you pointed out, where one draws a line between the extent of the public sector in the form of taxes and the private sector, that's something that gets worked out in a democratic political system, just as it is in Book 3 of Aristotle's Politics. But I would be more forthright and say that's why my ancestors, my grandfather and my father, came to this country. Your ancestors, and I suppose the ancestors of everybody who came to this country voluntarily came here. It's a land of freedom, not just because of capitalism.
So you would be, and so you just were. You said you would be more forthright, and I said, and so you have been. Yes, sir.
Can you just touch on your transition from socialism, and then you can say one thing on Bernie Sanders, what would it be?
Oh, I don't. My transition, well, it's kind of a kind of a long story, but I was a creature of the 60s, and I was kind of disenchanted with my own generation. There was a lot of refusal to try to think seriously or to try to learn or take on board what was happening in the rest of the world. It always seemed to me that communism was terribly wrong, that amounted to these brutal dictatorships, and I never believed in that, but I believed in a more pristine, free and democratic socialism. But it did start to trouble me why the places in the world that created socialism of some sort were all these appalling dictatorships, and where the socialists to my liking, the principled Democrats who were in the social democratic parties came to power, they never actually created socialism. They just created welfare states. They created more labor legislation that was more friendly to unions, and these were all things I believed in, but they didn't amount to socialism, and it sort of started me thinking why the socialism I believed in seemed so elusive, so hard for anyone to put into practice. And the socialism that was put into practice seemed to be such a travesty of the humanitarian ideals that I cherished. If I had to say one thing to Bernie Sanders right now, I guess I would say retire. Yes, sir.
So I have a question kind of linking things back to today.
Yeah.
So like obviously the other night was the State of the Union, and it's clear that job numbers in this country are really high.
Right.
And obviously it can be debated, but the economy is looking really good.
Right.
And yet socialism appears to still be on the rocks. So in your opinion, like through your experience, what do you think will it take in this country for socialism to come back down? Will it need to be tested and failed, or could that happen naturally?
Well, I hope not, because tested and failed would inevitably mean a lot of pain. And I don't mean to be tested by a dictatorship in this country, but it would probably mean a series of policies that would really rob us of a lot of prosperity before people say, wait a second, and that's in fact what happened with the Social Democrats in Europe. You know, when in the 1980s, for example, when François Mitterrand was elected, of the Socialist Party was elected president of France, and he had a more militant program than some of the other Socialist Party candidates who had preceded him. And the party program had the official, or maybe it was the informal title, La Rupture, complete rupture with the existing system and a leap to a socialist, or as far as you could get in the direction of a socialist economy. And he came in and started doing this, and within the first year, the economy was really going downhill. And after, early in the second year, they announced a reversal of course, and the chairman of the Socialist Party, who later became prime minister, Lionel Jospin, was quoted in the press as saying, "We have to bring about a real reconciliation between the left and the economy." And I think that sort of captures a lot. And so we could have it would take more than Sanders being elected president. You'd also have to have a Congress that was of similar mind, which is not in sight anywhere. But let's imagine it was so. I think we'd have a bunch of dramatic changes, and I think they would take a serious toll on the economy, and then probably there'd be a change of course. But I would like to believe we don't have to go down that path. I think right now we're in a strange context because we have this very strange president, and there's a lot of energy in reaction to him. I feel it myself, that I've rarely been so upset at a president, and that I think is affecting the atmosphere. And then we have just Sanders, and then these few people who got elected to Congress who have sort of put this on the agenda. But even with the public opinion polls that show much higher support for socialism than in the past, the polls are funny. They suggest that people aren't sure what they mean. It's kind of a new word in our lexicon, even though it's an old one to the world. So, for example, in this Pew poll that showed more Democrats saying they had a favorable view of socialism than of capitalism, but a very large share of them said they had a favorable view of socialism and of capitalism. And then there was an earlier Gallup poll in which more people said they were favorable. No, I think it was a YouGov poll, not Gallup. More people said they were favorable to socialism than to capitalism, but an even higher number than either of those numbers said they were favorable to free enterprise. That's your point about the sort of different nomenclature. Somehow when people think of capitalism, it seems to bring to mind something hard-nosed and cold and greedy, but if they think of free enterprise, they think of something more appealing. So, and also, by the way, in this third data point in this is that when Pew asks people, they don't just ask, are you favorable or unfavorable? It's very favorable, somewhat favorable, very unfavorable, somewhat unfavorable. And the large number who were favorable to socialism included only a quite small number who said they were very favorable. Whereas on the other side, the people who were favorable to capitalism, a substantial portion of them said they were very favorable. So it's as if this is a kind of new idea that people aren't sure what it means, but it sounds interesting and good. And I would think that rather than having to go down the path of trying to transform the American economy and getting a bunch of bad results and then people learning the hard way what others have already learned, that through public education and explaining that there really is a lot of history of socialism in the world and that it's not been a successful idea, that in itself could suffice to save us from going all the way down that path. Yes, sir.
My question is why do you think that the ideas of socialism seem to be so appealing to many young people today, especially considering that it's actually the opposite in the rest of the world? I myself come from a post-Soviet country, and what I have noticed back home that it's predominantly elderly people who support some ideas of socialism, while most of the young people and middle-aged people are extremely unfavorable to it. While in Western countries, I think that the majority of people who support it are young people.
Can you repeat that for the people in the back?
So the question was, why does it seem that in the West, the people who are most supportive of socialism are young people, but in this gentleman comes from a formerly communist country. In that part of the world, the people who are likely to be supporters of socialism are the old generation, and the young people don't feel support for it. I would say what Professor Brand said and what I argued with him about who it is attributable to, but that there was that saying that anyone who's not a socialist when he's 20 has no heart, and anyone who's still a socialist when he's 40 has no brain. I think it's a very apt saying, and that there's a lot of history of people like me who at being at the point of being 20, I mean, the idea of socialism sounds beautiful because on paper it is beautiful, And then with more experience with life, you get a greater appreciation for the fact that nothing ever works out the way it is on paper. And you have to ask yourself not just how beautiful this looks on paper, but what is likely to happen if you try to implement it. And it just, to get an appreciation for that problem, the difference between an ideal in the abstract and one that you can put into effect, requires, I think, a certain amount of maturity. So I think what you're alluding to in the U.S. or in the West, where this idea is more appealing to young people, is kind of natural. When you talk about the part of the world that you come from, I think we have a different phenomenon, which is that people who grew up under communism, where they were, they had a pretty poor standard of living, but there was a system that they adapted to that was unfree and repressive, but also guaranteed certain things in terms of pensions and low level of medical care, and so that suddenly communism's gone. There's a free market economy, and the worst circumstance in which to enter a free market economy is to be poor and old. So you got to pay for everything you want, and you don't have much money to pay for it, and you're at a certain age where where you can't say to yourself, well, I'm going to start a business and eventually I'll make some money and make up for where I am now, or I'm going to go get some job training or education, and then if you're in that unhappy circumstance of the older generation, your part of the world who grew up under communism, they're kind of stuck now, and they may feel that on the free market economy where nothing is guaranteed to them and they're not taken care of in any way, they're really vulnerable and hurting, and so they'd rather get back the protections that once existed, even if those came at a price. Well, this lady, I'll be glad to hear a second question from you, but let me get to people who haven't asked one yet. Yes, sir.
Yeah, sure. Can you talk a little more about Scandinavian countries and why they aren't technically socialist? I know people like Bernie Sanders, they point to them as sort of a model for modern socialism.
Right. So, let me say one thing that's a little bit mean-spirited, but I want to say it anyway, which is, I think the embrace of Scandinavia as the model is something that Bernie Sanders has come to only as a presidential candidate, and is not what his political history was. And so when he was mayor of Burlington, he arranged for Burlington to have sister cities relationships with two other cities, one in the Soviet Union and one in Sandinista, Nicaragua. There are a lot of cities in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark that have sister cities programs, but he was never interested in making Burlington a sister city with one of those. So I think historically he was much more, he was not a communist in the old sense of someone who belongs to the Communist Party and follows the party line. He was very eclectic, but I think that the communist countries, or at least some of them, were much more exciting to him than the social democracies of Scandinavia. That's just mean-spirited because it doesn't answer your question at all, which is what it just sort of gives you a hint of what I think of Bernie Sanders, but it doesn't tell you what I think of Scandinavia. They are countries that have significantly bigger welfare states than we have in the U.S. And they also went through the same process of Britain and France of, in a generation or so ago, the social democratic parties thought that they were going to create actual socialism step by step in a peaceful democratic way, and they ran into the economic downturns and retreated from that, but they didn't retreat from creating the very generous welfare states they have and more government provision of services like health and education than we have. But there are a few things about them that are important to know that if you want to call that socialism, it's fine with me. I have nothing against the Scandinavian system, but it's certainly different than I think most people's image of socialism, or at least of my image of socialism when I was a socialist, which is, first of all, they insist on having a very friendly climate to business. They appreciate that the private economy is what generates the wealth that makes it possible for them to do the welfare state. So, for example, the World Bank publishes each year what they call the ease of doing business scale. And they rate every country in the world on how easy or not easy it is to go, to start a business and to run a business. Last year, number 4 out of the 190 countries was Denmark. Number 8 was Norway. The US was 12 and Sweden was 13. But the scale changes a little bit, but basically year after year, the Scandinavian countries are way at the top for ease of doing business. And generally, they have, as a matter of policy, having a friendly environment for business, including, and most of them, no capital gains tax. They have, as a whole, those countries have higher taxes than we have, but with their more generous public sector, more generous welfare state, they do something much better than we do, which is they pay for it. We have now each year for the last several years, and I don't think it's good, and I think the Democrats and Republicans are equally responsible. Each year, we're adding $1 trillion to the national debt. Every year, we're having the government pay out $1 trillion more for various kinds of things than we're taking in taxes. There is a very appreciable danger that will catch up with us one of these days. You will suffer from that. I'll be gone. But it's a serious business. Do you know how much of a deficit Sweden, Norway, and Denmark ran last year? They all ran a surplus. Year before, same thing. So their government is spending more, but they're more willing to pay for it than we Americans, I'm embarrassed to say, seem to be. Second of all, they don't pay for it by some of what we've heard from some of the candidates. This won't cost you a penny because only billionaires will have to pay for it. There are high taxes for billionaires, and there are billionaires in Scandinavia, but there are much higher taxes on the middle class and the working class in those countries. A big part of their revenue comes from a national sales tax, what's called a value-added tax. And here we always look kind of askance on value-added taxes, at least from a liberal-minded point of view, because they're regressive. They're taxes. That is, they're the same for rich and poor, meaning proportionately they fall harder on the poor. The value-added tax in Sweden and Norway is around 25%. So middle-class people and poor people are paying heavier taxes there, as well as rich people, to pay for that welfare state. So I don't think there's anything wrong with the Scandinavian system. If Americans, if we collectively decide that what we'd like to do is to run more things through government, have a bigger public sector, fine. I think it's easier to do in a small population country that they are, a small homogeneous country that they are, than it is to do in a sprawling 350 million polyglot country like we are. But in theory, we could do it, and I don't think it would be terrible. But the key is, are we really, prepared to pay for it? Right now, we have smaller government programs, and we're not coming close to paying for them. Yes, sir.
I just have a quick question kind of based off of what Mark said when the workers kind of get poorer and then they'll rise up. Just kind of based on the current U.S. economy is obviously really healthy. There's a huge ranking of inequality, like well over 90% incomes are basically stagnant, the top 10% are skyrocketing. All this has to do kind of with tax policy, obviously, but do you think, just kind of where do you think inequality plays in this whole dilemma between free enterprise and then socialism?
Yeah, just as a factual matter, it was true that incomes below the top were stagnating, but it's not still, it hasn't been true the last few decades. It is true that incomes at the top are rising faster, and that's been going on for a while. I think there are things that can be done to ameliorate that through tax policy and some other policies, but it's also true that inequality has proved not as easy to get a hold of as it looks. There seems to be a big cultural factor. There's some parts of the world that have much more in the way of persistent inequality than others. Latin America, much more than Asia. It's not obvious to me, and I think it's not obvious to most economists why that's so. In Asia, you have a much more of a flourishing capitalist economy, and so there's some sort of non-structural cultural things that go in here, but I think that growing inequality is a bad thing. I mean, it's obviously less bad if people at the bottom are doing better, even if they're not doing better as fast as people at the top. But it's a bad thing for the sense of national cohesion. And if people had persuasive ways of ameliorating it, I would vote for that. Now, we do, there are measures often of pure income versus income after various programs that already exist that transfer money to those more in need. And if you look at the numbers for income after transfers, they're less alarming in terms of inequality than raw income numbers.
Right, we've kept Professor Muravchik going for a long time now, so please join me.
Thank you.